When you take a close look at history, you clearly realize that there are many key chokepoint moments that, if even slightly changed, would have taken the entire world in a completely different trajectory. World War I saw the Germans nearly conquering Paris twice, the mass industrialization of warfare, the first massive overseas intervention by the next world superpower, the United States, the foundations of the French and British empires shaken and broken, and the fall of 4 historic European empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires. All of that happening within 4 years only. Not to mention that from the ashes of the war, with the first communist and fascist states rise, laying the direct foundations from which World War II and the Cold War could happen as well. All these historic events happening within the blink of an eye at the scale of history. Today, because of the static trench warfare, World War I is often perceived as a linear event that can be summarized by the direct consequences of the end of the war. It is true that there were months that felt like years of emptiness during the war, but there were also numerous battles in which decades of history were written within weeks. In this video, we will dive into 5 of the most decisive World War I battles in which a different outcome would have taken world history in a completely different direction. Number 5. The Battle of Tannenberg. Fought between the Germans and the Russians in the first month of the war, the Battle of Tannenberg would be the very first world-shaking event that World War I had in store. The very first surprise was how quickly the Russians were able to mobilize and advance into German territory. The German High Command estimated that it would take at least 6 weeks before the Russians would be able to pose a real threat in the east. Based on this assumption, Germany entered World War I following the Chieftain Plan, which aimed at taking Paris and crushing France within 6 weeks before the Russians could mobilize and then deploy all their forces on their eastern border to fight Russia, thus avoiding a two-front war which Germany wanted to avoid at all costs. What the Germans didn't anticipate is that the First Russian Army would start advancing into Germany only 2 weeks after the war had started, and the Second Russian Army would follow a few days after that. Indeed, the Russians were able to mobilize 2 armies and have them cross the borders in less than 3 weeks, which was extremely fast at the time. This shocked the German commanders, who thought they had up to 2 months before they'd have to fight a war in the east, and that started a wave of panic in Germany. After initial successes, the Russians were advancing into East Prussia with the likely goal of conquering the German city of Königsberg. The news of not only 1 but 2 Russian armies moving almost completely free caused a strong panic within the German civilians, with mass evacuations taking place. German General Maximilian von Prittwitz, defending East Prussia with the German 8th Army, sought to reassure the population and attack the Russian First Army at the Battle of Gumbinnen. But because of the under-preparation and the hastiness of the attack, the Germans were defeated, thus allowing the Russians to keep advancing into German territory. German General Maximilian von Prittwitz started to panic as well and even strongly considered to retreat 150 km west. However, such decision was deemed completely unacceptable by the German High Command, who feared that after taking Königsberg, the Russians would even be able to threaten Berlin itself. Von Prittwitz was therefore replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who quickly realized how disorganized the Russians were. Indeed, the Russian military was communicating by radio in clear plain Russian, allowing the German intelligence to know exactly how the Russians were maneuvering. Not only that, but the Russian generals commanding the 2 armies, Rennenkampf and Samsonov, hated each other and refused to coordinate properly. Quickly maneuvering by rail transports, the German 8th Army quickly encircled the Second Russian Army and nearly destroyed it completely. With nearly 150,000 men either killed, injured or captured, Russian General Samsonov took his own life, while Rennenkampf, general of the First Russian Army, decided to withdraw from East Prussia, thus not only saving Germany from the Russian incursion, but also giving the German Empire the initiative for months. This astonishing defeat demoralized the Russians and sent a shockwave in the entire world. However, even in defeat, the Russians achieved one of their goals: slow down the German advance in France. In the midst of the panic, the Germans redeployed 80,000 of their men from the Western Front to the east, and this unexpected decision brought great consequences with it. This redeployment not only forced the Germans to hasten their attack on Paris, but also created a gap in their advance that the French and the British were able to exploit at the Battle of the Marne. Because of that, the Germans were pushed back, Paris was saved, and the Western Front remained. Now, had the Russians won at Tannenberg and kept pushing west, it is likely that they would have taken Königsberg and put an even greater pressure on the German Eastern Front, and it may have accelerated the eventual Allied victory. Number 4. The Battle of the Somme. One of the most brutal battles ever fought in human history, the Battle of the Somme has become the symbol of the brutality and the pointlessness of 401 fighting. Beginning on the 1st of July 1916, its two main goals were to break through German lines and restore movement to the war, but also to help the French who were resisting the Germans at a very heavy cost at Verdun. With both sides aligning hundreds of thousands of men in northern France, the stage was set for one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The battle began with a gigantic British artillery barrage on the German lines. Thinking that the enemy's defense were completely destroyed, the British High Command ordered their men to march in line towards the German trenches. This very quickly turned out to be one of the greatest mistakes in history. The German defenders had survived the artillery barrage and were able to defend their positions. Unprepared for this resistance, the British took titanic casualties. In a single day, they lost 60,000 men, including 20,000 deaths. Despite these horrific losses, the British and the French would keep pushing day after day, despite the front line barely moving, hoping to achieve a breakthrough in the enemy defenses that would never come. After 4 months of brutal fighting, the Allies would only advance about 10 kilometers deep. With such limited gains, the results of the battle remained inconclusive. However, the strategic gains for the French and the British were considerable. First, the offensive reached its goal of wearing down the Germans enough at the Somme so that the French would hold the line at Verdun and reconquer their lost positions. Second, the introduction of the tanks by the British started changing the nature of the conflict until the return of the war movement later on, which hastened the German defeat. Third, after the fake Gallipoli offensive, the Battle of the Somme was the first massive French and British coordinated offensive, laying the foundations for further Allied joint operations in the First World War, the Second World War, and even in more recent conflicts. Had the Somme offensive either failed, decisively succeeded, or even not happened at all, it is very possible that World War I would have ended in a very different way. Number 3. The Brusilov offensive. Not remembered as much as other battles such as the Somme, the Brusilov offensive is actually one of the most important battles of the entire war. Beginning on the 4th of June 1916, the Russian Empire sought to regain the initiative after a year of continuous defeat, crush the Austro-Hungarian Empire for good, and help the French who were fighting their own historic battle at Verdun at the same time. Russian General Alexei Brusilov suggests new revolutionary tactics that would prove decisive during the upcoming offensive. Taken by surprise by the new Russian strategy, the Austro-Hungarian front collapsed, allowing the Russians to advance up to 60 km deep in a few days only. After 10 days of intense battle, Austria-Hungary suffered massive casualties and had 400,000 of their soldiers taken prisoners by the Russian Empire. At this point already, within the very first few weeks of the beginning of the offensive, the Austro-Hungarian army was actually nearing complete collapse, then had to ask the Germans for help, who had no other choice but to massively intervene directly. After achieving its first goal of giving the initiative back to the Russians, the Brusilov offensive would achieve its second goal of relieving the French at Verdun after hundreds of thousands of German soldiers would be sent to prevent Austria-Hungary's complete collapse. However, that wouldn't be enough to halt the Russian advance until the fall, when the Russians would reach the Carpathian Mountains. But despite such a massive success, Russia would not be able to fully exploit its victory. In fact, the cost of this victory for Russia was so high that it ended up causing them more harm than good. With up to 1 million casualties for each side, the Russian military will never recover from this offensive and will never be able to launch a new one after that. Not only that, but the victory came at such a cost that it will only end up accelerating Russia's deep political crisis, ending by the revolutions we all know of today. After the communist coup d'etat, Russia would withdraw from the war and temporarily give up its empire. Now, had the Russian Brusilov offensive been even a slightly greater success, it is extremely likely that history would have taken a completely different trajectory. Indeed, it is very likely that the Allies would have been able to conclude a separate peace treaty with Austria-Hungary, thus isolating Germany on the Eastern Front. The Austro-Hungarian army suffered 1 million casualties in the summer of 1916, and the various nationalities of the empire were beginning to refuse to fight. Panic gained Vienna, and discreet diplomatic canals were activated with the purpose of signing peace with Russia and the Allies. If that happened, that would have completely isolated Germany on the Eastern Front, reduced the length of the front lines by hundreds of kilometers for the Russians, given immense prestige to the Russian Empire, and inflicted a severe blow to the German morale. And it might even have prevented the Russian Revolution, or at least altered it just enough to prevent the communist coup d'etat and the following civil war. The USSR would have never existed, and traditional Russia might still be around today. A different outcome at the Brusilov offensive would have completely changed World War I, Russian history, and that of the rest of the world. Number 2. The German Spring Offensive and the 100 Days Offensive. In 1918, it almost seemed that Europe was ripe for German domination. Indeed, Germany had just signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, not only granting it a massive empire in the east, but also full peace on the Eastern Front. The German Empire, having now eliminated what it considered its greatest threat, Russia, could now redeploy 50 divisions from the Eastern Front to Western Europe. And since Germany was able to crush the Russians in the east, while still holding off France and Britain in the west for now almost 4 years, it was fairly reasonable to think that the Germans were going to obliterate the Western Front as well now. However, Germany was actually in a very difficult situation. The first major problem that the Germans were facing was hunger. Indeed, England had been blockading the German coast for years now, cutting off almost all food imports into Germany. Millions of men had been conscripted into the military, severely reducing the workforce for food production. Also taking into account that the factories had to keep feeding the never slowing down war machine. It is estimated that many Germans living in the cities were only eating 1,000 calories a day, with up to 700,000 people dying of hunger. This obviously caused deep political instability, with many strikes and riots taking place all over the country. The second major problem that Germany was facing was the United States. The American entry in the war, just a year ago, was going to give the Allies an immense advantage in logistics, industrial power and manpower. The US military potential was gigantic and untapped until now. All of this led the Germans to calculate that if they didn't crush France and negotiate a separate peace deal with the United Kingdom before the fall of 1918, they will lose. With this gruesome and scary prediction in mind, and the arrival of hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the east, the stage was set for a gigantic fight for survival on a scale never seen before. Beginning on the 21st of March, the German Spring Offensive, or known in German as the Kaiserschlacht, started with massive German assaults in Picardy, France, and in Flanders, Belgium, mainly against the British. The first phase of the offensive was a success, and the German advances were the greatest on the Western Front since 1914, when the Germans almost reached Paris. The goal was to separate the Allied forces, reach the English Channel, and crush the British army. However, due to logistical issues and lack of manpower reserve, the Germans were unable to sustain their progression, and most of their assaults, after huge initial successes, halted. In May, the Germans then launched an all-out offensive in the direction of Paris and reached the Marne, threatening the French capital itself. Civilians were leaving Paris due to the shelling, and the French government strongly considered evacuating the capital to Bordeaux once again. However, the Germans were suffering from the same problems they did further north. They lacked the manpower to exploit their victories, and the soldiers, exhausted and hungry, couldn't keep up. In July, the Germans attempted to break through the Allied lines one last time, but failed. And this time, the trenches they were trying to capture were not only French, British or Belgian, but also American. The German Empire was stopped at the Marne once again, as it was in 1914. The Germans had failed to save their country from defeat. With the German war machine exhausted and hundreds of thousands of American soldiers fresh and ready to fight, it was time for the Allies to counterattack. Beginning in August, the 100 Days Offensive sought to crush Germany into surrendering and end the war once and for all. The offensive started with the Battle of Amiens, in which 100,000 casualties were inflicted in only 4 days, and ended with very significant Allied gains. The Allies then continued launching coordinated attacks on the entire front line, with overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority, using tanks and aircraft to break through enemy lines, reaching levels of horror and violence almost never seen before. The situation kept getting worse and worse for Germany at home, now on the brink of revolution. Their defensive lines completely collapsed, and the Kaiser abdicated. With almost 2 million casualties, whether killed, injured or prisoners in 1918 alone, broken defensive lines, deep political instability and famine at home, the new German government had no choice but to surrender. On the 11th November 1918, after one last brutal year of fighting, the First World War ended. But had the Germans taken Paris in June 1918, it is not unrealistic to think that the French government might have asked for peace, soon followed by the British, thus allowing the Germans to secure a much more favorable peace and keep some of its freshly acquired Eastern Europe empire as well. Of course, we can't ignore Germany's deep political crisis going on at the same time, but a final victory and an end of the British blockade might have prevented the worst. Germany would have remained a dominant empire, thus changing history forever. Number 1. The First Battle of the Marne. The First World War is most often remembered as a long conflict that lasted for years, with very static front lines, but it actually came very close to ending very quickly. In 1914, at the beginning of the war, the German Empire went all in with the Chiffren Plan, which goal was to conquer Paris within 6 weeks in order to force peace upon France as fast as possible. And this plan came very close to succeeding. Invading through Belgium, the Germans completely overwhelmed the French defenses and reached as close as 30 kilometers north of Paris. Panic was beginning to take over the Allies, and anticipating a fifth battle, hundreds of thousands of people were evacuating Paris and its surroundings. And on the 2nd of September, barely a month after the beginning of the war, the French government made the difficult decision to evacuate the capital as well. The Germans having won every single battle on the Western Front until now, the Allies feared the repetition of the 1871 catastrophic French defeats. However, air reconnaissance had identified a huge gap between the German armies, with German General von Kluck shifting from the initial plan without noticing his peers and superiors. In a desperate last attempt to save Paris from falling, French and British forces put their differences aside and launched a joint counterattack, exploiting the gap between the German armies. The Allied counteroffensive was a decisive victory, and the Germans had to retreat 50 kilometers further north on more easily defendable positions. In a single week of fighting, combined casualties on both sides climbed to 500,000 between dead, injured, missing, and captured. After that, operations from both sides greatly slowed down and the trenches began to appear. But had the Schlieffen Plan succeeded, it is very realistic to think that France would have asked for peace after the fall of Paris, soon followed by the British. Italy, Romania, and most importantly the US would have never joined the Allies, and these Central Powers would only have to focus on Russia. The Great War would have ended as soon as 1915, if not even 1914, with a decisive Central Powers victory, taking world history in a completely new direction. But instead, the Germans were stopped at such a crucial turning point in the war, and German General Chief of Staff Helmut von Moltke wrote to his wife, the night after having ordered the retreat, "Things have not gone well, the fighting east of Paris has not gone in our favor, and we shall have to pay for the damage we have done," strongly foreshadowing the fate that his country would have to face just 4 years later. So this is 5 of the most decisive battles of the First World War. Each one of these battles played a crucial role in our history, and a different outcome might have changed everything for us. I hope you enjoyed this video. If that's the case, please like, subscribe and share. And if that is your will, I'll see you in the next one.